Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar. Again, my name is Faris Mohiuddin. I'm an undergrad, law school, and business school alum. We're going to get started ASAP just in order to cover all the material. But up top, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping notes to orient what we're going to do. So we're going to do about 40 minutes of panel responses to key topics that were flagged in the invite. Then we're hoping to leave aside 5 minutes for questions that were submitted during the panel by attendees. One other note is that there will be a recording that'll be made available on the SLS website, and the SLS alumni office will send an email to all registrants. A couple of notes specifically for the attendees. You're in a view-only experience, so you won't be able to unmute and you won't be able to use video. So if you feel like screaming at me, I know I have that effect on people. Unfortunately, you will not be able to actively intervene. There is a Q&A feature that you'll be able to see through Zoom, and that's available for all attendees to ask additional questions of the speakers. And attendees can upvote other people's questions. So when we hit the point where we're doing open Q&A, I'll pull open the bank of questions that have been upvoted and cover off top to bottom, unless I don't like the question. So without further ado, just to give you guys a little bit more context on why we're having this event. I'm a Bay Area native, spent too many years at Stanford, but to give you a bit of context on why I thought this would be a good event to hold is by virtue of my academic and extracurricular interests, countless of my contemporary friends went straight through to law school, whereas I worked for a few years out of undergrad. But towards the end of my JD MBA program, I started to get questions from my friends who were now a few years into practicing law, but now they were asking me how and if they could make the transition out of law into some other path. Now, mind you, these were people who attended the very top law schools in the country, had prestigious clerkships, and worked at uber elite law firms. And yet, even within that very rarefied cohort, they were still trying to figure out a way to potentially do something else. So I would have conversations responding to these people's frenzied texts, and it happened more and more. And eventually, I somehow became known as somewhat of a not lawyer whisperer to people. So I was getting referred to friends of friends, colleagues of friends, to have the same conversation. So I guess as much of an ego trip as it is for me to be asked about this stuff all the time, I'm also very lazy. So aside from this being a relevant topic for the SLS alumni community, I figured having a recording of this panel would save me a lot of extra conversations down the road. So that said, I never planned to practice and ultimately never did. Thus, it made a lot more sense to assemble a group of SLS alums who've made the transition outside of practicing law and at three very different stages. And so with that, I'm going to first turn it over to them to give them a brief overview of their background and what their story of making the non-law transition was. And any one of you, Mark, Monty, or Patrick, who want to jump in, feel free to start.
We're all jumping in at the same time here. I'm shocked. Yeah, Faris, I guess I was very surprised that you didn't proceed with a career in law after your amazing summer associate experiences during law school. But good to find you on the other side of the aisle. Yeah, so I don't know what's extremely helpful for the group here, but background, I grew up in Florida, did my undergrad at Swarthmore College, a small liberal arts school in the Northeast, which is really good for preparing you to go into a PhD program, or, perhaps be at like the front lines of a, activist rally, but really not much else. So and now I realize it's being recorded, so I'll have to be a little bit more measured with my thoughts from here on out. But then from there, I went and I worked as an engineer. I did my undergraduate in physics and philosophy, worked as an engineer for a while. Long story short, figured out that wasn't for me. I actually experimented with going down the academia path, but in sort of a very short stint that was intended to be experimental, with kind of the backup plan of going to law school. And lo and behold, that's where I wound up. Graduated in 2013, which is 9 years after I graduated undergrad. So spent a little bit of time, kind of stewing on what I might want to do in the meantime. Then I did 3 years at Oric, which is, Bay Area based firm. I was in the startup and venture capital practice there. And after 3 years, I moved on into what became a hybrid legal and operational role at a growing tech company, a company called Brava. It's in the consumer cooking electronics space. I joined when we were about 5 or 6 people. We grew up to 90 people at our peak. After about 4 years, we got acquired. I was there for about 5.5 years in all. So I started out just kind of being, all hands on deck, doing whatever the company needed me to do. And then, as we grew, became, was kind of focused on the legal role, and then really transitioned much more into a business operations role at the end of the day. So that's just kind of in a nutshell what I did. I'm actually back practicing law now, which I'm sure is fascinating for this panel, but happy to get into, any and all details of all those decisions and paths as we get into it.
I can jump in next. Hi, everyone. My name is Monsi. I'm from Westchester, New York. I'm currently based in Brooklyn. I got my undergrad degree from University of Pennsylvania, where I was kind of a total humanities nerd and pursued history and global health, and maybe similar to what Mark echoed, didn't really know what to do with that afterwards. I was always interested in social impact, and I thought that law could be sort of a respectable professional path to creating impact. Ended up taking the LSAT and going straight through to law school, where I got my JD at Stanford. I realized pretty early on that maybe this wasn't the right path for me, but I did give it a shot. Took a summer associate job in BigLaw, which sort of further confirmed and validated that this wasn't for me. In order to sort of position myself to do something else, ended up applying for a dual degree program, where I got my MS in management science and engineering from the engineering school. I turned down my return offer at the firm and spent a lot of my last year kind of stressed out and frantically trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. Being in the Bay Area, I was pretty excited about the ability to, create impact through technology and the kind of growing ecosystem of both startups and big tech located there physically. Since then, I've been working at growth stage companies from seed stage all the way through exit and acquisition across a variety of different roles, including marketing, strategy, operations, and most recently product management, which I've loved because I've found that function really is at the heart of a tech company, driving the strategic direction of the user experience and the company's strategy overall. I'm currently a group product manager at Maven Clinic, which is a Series D digital health product for women and families that supports patients through starting, growing, and raising a family. And I've been lucky enough to be a user of that product as well. And for those who are sort of unfamiliar with the title, group product manager means I lead a team of product managers that are thinking about the future of the user experience. And my team is specifically focused on our telehealth features, so how patients connect with providers through video and messaging.
And I'll round it out. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick. I'm originally from Connecticut. I went to Yale University for my undergrad. I also got my master's degree. I studied history there and focused on medieval history, and very interesting. And, I thought about maybe doing a PhD in that at one point, but I decided instead to go to law school. So I went straight through to Stanford, where I had an amazing time. I loved Stanford Law School, especially the people I met. including Faris and Mark, met you guys there, which was great, and many other great people. After law school, I went to work at a law firm in Mexico City. So I was there for almost a year, and that was very interesting. It was because of my summer associate position. I'd been doing Latin America corporate deals and knew I wanted to do something a little different. I really didn't know at that point that maybe I wanted to sort of transition out of the field, but I was looking for some variety, I thought, or at least before starting at Simpson Thacher in New York, where then I spent 2 years doing mostly M&A and capital markets and also LATAM corporate work. Pretty interesting. And, that was definitely the classic white shoe New York law firm experience. So very intense. And at that point, I sort of was thinking that I wanted to do something else or try something else. So I did I went to Fenwick and West, where I worked in the startup and venture capital group and worked directly with, small startups and larger growth stage companies, and did that for a year before jumping to join what was then a very, very small startup called Say Technologies. It's a fintech that has a shareholder engagement and broker-dealer operations combined product. It was recently acquired by Robinhood. What I did there was, at first it was like a mixed product legal role. It was a heavily regulated industry. You had to be very familiar with the proxy rules, Rule 14A and all that stuff. So that was my in. I can help you with this, and I can help interpret all this. And then by the time I left, I was doing more of a pure product and operations role. And now I'm COO and head of product at Alchemy, which is a startup based in New York. And our product is workflow automation software. And so, I do run product there mostly as my number one focus. And yeah, so looking forward to the panel, and that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. So you guys in your introductions effectively covered off on the first pre-planned question I had regarding when did you first start thinking about taking a non-legal role? So what I'll instead do is drill into maybe the trickier question, which might be helpful to the audience, in terms of how did you distinguish moments in which you were either just temporarily burnt out or bored in your big law job or in your legal studies, versus when you knew you truly needed or wanted to make a serious change? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Well, for me, it was at Fenwick. I thought what the companies were doing was so cool, and I really wanted to do something like that. For anyone thinking about, especially making a jump into tech or startups, I think that it's a really good way to do it, is to look at one of those firms and position yourself in one of those groups, because you get to work directly with entrepreneurs and operators and all that. So for me, it was like, wow, okay, I found the thing, because working with the private equity firms and banks at Simpson Thacher, that didn't seem so great to me. I'm sure it is, but it didn't seem so great to me. And but seeing the entrepreneurs and what they were doing, that was like, I want to do that. So that was when I realized I want to try and get into their seat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever was able to fully disentangle being burnt out from not being interested in the work anymore. I think they're kind of intertwined issues. I think I got sick of doing the amount of work and type of work that I was doing in that amount. I'm sure there would have been some universe in which I was happy to do the type of work I was doing in some kind of lesser amount, but that just wasn't kind of the reality of the situation. So it basically became clear to me that I didn't want to, be kind of turning the crank on, transactions that I felt like, a man on the street could, a smart person on the street could kind of learn how to do very quickly and become good at very quickly and kind of contribute to in a way that wasn't substantially worse than me. It wasn't very inspiring to do kind of what I felt like was commodified work, and certainly not that quantity. So I think the two issues were kind of intertwined. And I think that's, ultimately what fed into me wanting to try different things.
Oh, sorry. I can add the perspective of maybe someone who made that choice earlier on while I was in school. So, you know, I'm sure as a lot of people here, I always, you know, loved school. And actually my first year of law school was the first time I found myself a bit bored in my classes and uninspired by a lot of the reading and regurgitating, a lot less sort of discussion and collaboration. And probably the most fun experience I had in law school was my clinic experience. I was in I think it was called Organizations and Transactions Clinic, where I was partnering in a team environment with impactful Bay Area organizations, namely nonprofits, on like interesting business problems. And I really was excited and inspired by that opportunity to kind of work with business partners and decision makers in that experience. And through immersing myself in courses outside of the law school, but within the broader Stanford ecosystem, and especially in the business school and design school, I got really fired up by new opportunities I found to kind of take risks and try new things instead of being in the position of educating others about risks, building a product instead of a service, thinking creatively about the future, and like being able to operate sort of independently and autonomously instead of within like hierarchical structures and in more sort of like casual working environments.
Great, thank you. I'll throw in a little bit of editorial here, only from the perspective of someone who's had to walk a lot of lawyers off the cliff when they think that they're absolutely ready to stop. Because oftentimes people have sort of the grass is always greener syndrome, where they think that there are other things in the world that'll automatically be more edifying or more interesting without doing any work to understand what the world really looks like or how much work will be required to make that transition. So what I often would counsel my friends who are thinking about it or saying they were ready for a change was to ask them, are they willing to take a significant pay cut if they have to move laterally into a different space or another stage company? Are they willing to spend possibly several months in the job hunt, either part-time or full-time, trying to sort of hustle your way to getting a foot in the door, to be able to try something new? And I think in a lot of those cases, my friends very quickly would be like, no, I'm not that desperate yet. I'll text you in another 6 months. And I think that's actually a very helpful sanity check, because if you want to make the transition, it won't be terribly easy and it will require quite a bit of investment. So if you find that any of the advice that we're giving you today seems incredibly daunting or not something you want to do, then maybe you should think of other ways in which you can make your legal practice more sustainable, whether it's changing teams internally, taking a vacation. Just be open to other steps like that, because you have to be fairly committed, especially the further you are in your career, to sort of make the leap off of the legal train. Okay, end of my editorial there.
Can I editorialize based on that?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think also a related issue is that maybe some of the reasons that, you know, the legal job isn't working for you. I mean, this is certainly true of me, so I won't talk in the second person. You know, some of the reasons that it wasn't working for me had to do with me and not with the legal job, and had to do with the way my relationship with the job, you know, how I interacted with colleagues, how I interacted with clients, the types of boundaries I set or didn't set, and just how I just kind of went about navigating the job. And a lot of those things, those sorts of ways of kind of being at work and interacting at work, those will follow you, because those are the ways that you do things. It doesn't have to do with the way, you know, the firm makes you do things necessarily. So you might find that if you go to a different role, you actually have some similar experiences and some of the similar difficulties. They might sort of come up and, you know, rear their heads in different ways, but the root of them still might be just the way that you're interacting with people, and the way, and your kind of own relationship with work. So I think, I mean, for me, I learned a lot about kind of what my relationship with work was by doing work at the firm and then doing work outside of the firm in a variety of different kinds of roles, and seeing the types of things that I wanted to change about how I interacted with people and how I wanted to, you know, just go about my workday. And I think that those were all very helpful learning experiences in terms of deciding what I wanted to do, and good things to think about in terms of, are these things that I could change now while I'm at the firm to determine whether or not the firm life might be actually for me.
Right. Thank you. So to switch a little bit, and I know you guys covered off a little bit on this, but for the benefit of everyone else, once you sort of discovered that you knew you might want to try something else, how did you go about doing almost basic research to expose yourself to the world of opportunities that might be out there? And that can be in terms of industries, roles, company stage. And if anyone has any guidance for others, even if it's outside of what you personally did, I think people would appreciate that.
You got to network. That's the most important thing, in my opinion. You have to put yourself out there. I don't really like networking naturally, but it's something that I've learned how to do, and I think it's incredibly valuable. So I think you have to go and meet people who have maybe the job that you might want or think you might want, or is doing something that you think is interesting, and talk to them. And they'll talk to you. People are usually open to it. I mean, and especially if you went to Stanford Law School, like, you're an interesting person. And you might not think what you do is so interesting, but I guarantee you could tell an interesting story about, your day-to-day, some crazy deal or something like that. Like, it's most people don't know about that kind of world. So you have plenty to talk about, and then you can learn from them. And then the other thing I did was, I sort of worked for free for a variety of different startups and things like that, just to sort of get myself in there. And because you have a lot to offer, whether it's to help with some, like working at Fenwick, I knew how to set up companies, and I knew about cap tables and things like that. Entrepreneurs are usually pretty bad at that. And so you can help, you have a lot of value to add, especially if you have that skill set. So networking and kind of finding ways to make yourself useful, like as a next step, it's not that hard to do that. And then before you know it, you're talking regularly to someone who, in my case, that's how I got my first job, is just, really sort of, hey, how can I help? And they're usually, especially you're talking about a startup, there usually is probably some way for you to help. So that's my advice on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, I'd add to that, like, definitely, as echoing Patrick, like, people is the number one way. So within the Stanford Alumni Network, I specifically looked for like profiles of people who had transitioned from law into something else, and asked them about how they made their transition. Within my college alumni network, or people I was connected through LinkedIn, I found models of other people who had career paths that were interesting to me, and just set up time to learn more. Through the institution, if you're looking to make that change early on, I remember speaking to Susan Robinson, who's on this call, and getting permission to attend some of the B-School recruiting events, and get access to some of the employers who are coming to campus for other types of roles there. And then through the internet too, I mean, especially within startups, there's just so many different opportunities. And I did a lot of reading about, for example, rising health tech companies in New York, kind of look at lists of category leaders in that space, and go on their websites and learn more about their product, just to kind of see what else is out there.
I mean, I think one other thing you can do to complement that is just interview for like any and everything that you might be able to interview for. And it can be sort of scary in the sense like, oh, well, I'm not qualified for this role. Why do I have any business interviewing for it? But if you look at it just from terms of, I'm just learning about what's out there, talking to people about what they're doing, and using it purely as an experience for you to kind of gain information, I think that's helpful. Whether or not it's for a non-legal or a legal role, you still actually can learn quite a bit about different kinds of businesses, how they work, what their needs are, just by getting out there and interviewing a bunch. And it's a lot of these things are just kind of like, and any kind of networking or interacting with other people are very like stochastic processes. Like, you do it a bunch of times, nothing happens, but then all of a sudden, like one thing leads to another, and like you meet somebody in something you're really interested in, you hit it off, and boom, there we are, and you have a job offer at something you're interested at. So you just kind of have to keep on putting the legwork and putting yourself out there in a variety of different ways. And I would just say kind of, fire hose it as much as possible.
I'll only add a brief tactical recommendation that seems to work well for people. It can be challenging, and procrastination can step in to broadly tell yourself you will network, put yourself out there, or go to meetups. So one like mental device you could use is almost set a quota. And by that, I mean, make a rule that every week you'll have at least 3 interesting conversations with somebody who's working on something that you find interesting. It can be a friend of yours, someone within your LinkedIn network, or it can be a college alum. But if you almost create that artificial requirement that no matter what, you'll have 3 conversations, yeah, your hit rate won't be 1,000. It won't even be like, 10%. But you'll be amazed at how that forces you to move along. And if it's done via Zoom, then you're not subject to whether or not there are meetups, or if you're in a good or bad wave of whatever COVID is in your respective city. It is always something that you can do that always makes you feel like you're making forward momentum. So to segue a little bit, and I think this would be particularly useful for folks out there who are open to other business operating roles, but just aren't aware of what's out there / what the legal skill sets can more readily translate to. Now, since you guys have effectively worked on both sides of the house and seen how different functions operate and what backgrounds lend themselves more or less to success in there, curious if there are any types of functional roles within companies that you think lawyers or people with legal backgrounds can more readily transition into, and why, ideally.
I've gone first, so I didn't want to. I'm happy to. Okay, I will. Did you want to go, Nancy? All right.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
So I was going to say, any role that you take that's non-legal is going to require some element of a learning curve for sure. And to echo what Faris said earlier, there has to be some willingness to, start from the ground up a little bit and kind of learn quickly and prove your value. But that being said, I think at least within tech companies, I found that operations roles, strategy roles, and sometimes like growth roles, like sales and client success, kind of tend to be areas where you can show core competencies that you learn as a lawyer can transfer to some of those functions. So some of those competencies being things like effective communication, structured thinking, analytical rigor. So I would really focus my narrative on the skills and how the skills transfer from what I've done in law to what is required to be successful in that function. If you want to move into the more technical side of the organization, like product management and product design, engineering, that's where you might have to do some more work to kind of find the organization you want to be in, and then lateral your way into the actual function you want over time, and where you may actually need to go and acquire some additional skill set. And there are a variety of ways to do that, either by working closely with people on those teams, or going and pursuing some sort of like boot camp to demonstrate your interest and ramp up your skills pretty quickly.
The only thing that I would add is if you're willing to take an entry-level job, there are a lot of non-technical roles that you could take at like a startup or a growth phase company. It's really a function of financially, what is your tolerance to make a small fraction of what you were making before? And then possibly ego-wise to be working alongside 21-year-olds who are fresh out of college. What I would say, because I literally did this where I was in a bottom rung job out of the JD MBA program, is if you prove that you are good and capable at it. So I did entry-level sales development, quite literally the worst possible job one can have in a tech company, generally speaking. Within 2 months, because I had unfair advantages because we were selling analytics tools to product teams. And as a person who was 29 at the time, a lot of my friends ran product at very large companies. I was very good at selling products into large logos because I could force our stuff down the throats of my friends. So within 2 months, they were like, okay, we can promote you to some imaginary job that didn't already exist. So there are opportunities for flexibility, but you have to be willing to quite literally start at the bottom. And if you are, people do respect that you're not behaving in an untitled way, which is a mistake I think a lot of lawyers make when they try to make the transition. They assume because they had a private office and all this education that they deserve to have a cushy job, especially if you're talking to startup leadership, that orientation will not fly terribly well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, the farther you are from, your core competencies, like and I would say your hardcore competencies, like the more you're going to have to do that. A lot of these roles, like there's just a lot of kind of, jargon, tools, things that are second nature to someone who's worked in that particular position for 2, 3, 5 years. But someone that's coming fresh into it from a legal role will have absolutely no experience with. And it's going to be very difficult to, even jump in and have an initial conversation with someone about, and try to justify being able to take on, a non-entry level position in something that's so far from what your core competency. If you're looking to do something that's a little bit more kind of operational or general administrative, like I did, I think that, things that you're learning at the law firm are going to be, kind of much more directly relevant to at least some aspect of what you're doing at the job. You're going to be able to talk about those things in a little bit more of a competent way and discuss how you can kind of add value to what the team is doing in more of a competent way, analogous to what Pat did with, kind of his initial role where he was helping out with some regulatory considerations, to what I did when I was helping out with, finance and HR. These are things that I touched upon in my legal role that maybe I didn't, really delve into seriously on a day-to-day basis, but which I knew enough about to be able to talk intelligently about and have an idea about how I was going to be able to fill the startup's need. Whereas if I tried to jump in product, like I would just be completely clueless.
Yeah, but I think looking for smaller companies, I think is a good thing to do also, in addition to looking for companies where your skill set as a lawyer is going to just be more valuable because you're in a regulated space. And there are lots of those, like every single fintech, for example, has something like that, or some, they're going to need someone interpreting regulations, and that's going to touch product for sure. And if you do a good job at it, it's going to make the product better. But also, so smaller companies, because I joined 2 startups that ended up growing as like the 5th employee, and that is something that and having done that now at a small company, somebody who shows up who really wants to be there, who went to Stanford Law School, like you'll find a place for them. Like you're gonna find a place for them. You're not gonna say, oh no, go, we'll talk to you later. Absolutely not. And if they do, you don't want to join that company. Honestly, I mean, as long as you're doing an okay job and the get to know you process, they're gonna, I think, feel like there's at least a case to be made. I do product. I actually think lawyers, I think certainly you need to have some technical knowledge and you can develop that on the job. I wouldn't overestimate how technical it is though. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're doing, but it's not like you're not writing code. Okay. The engineers definitely don't want you doing that. So you don't even try. And you're not, you might need to know some SQL, you'll definitely need to know about the different frameworks that are in use and all that sort of what the stack is, but it's not maybe as technical as you might think. And what you do have as a lawyer is especially like I learned how to serve customers, users, clients as a lawyer. You need to be like obsessed with getting it right and perfect. And I learned that at Simpson Thatcher. And so that's something I've carried with me, is just sweating the details is very, very important. Making sure everything's kind of on track, very important. That's a big part of it. Planning things out, communicating, you're kind of explaining why you need to do things or why someone should work on something, why it should be a priority. That's another thing that I think you learn as a lawyer, like explaining, giving bad news to a client or something like that, or working in a negotiation. That's very hard. And writing those emails that you write as a lawyer, that's not something that a lot of people, I think, get to exercise that muscle. And you end up being really good at like writing, like let's say a spec for a new feature or something like that. That's something that, you're going to be crisp, clear. Everyone will be able to understand what you're saying. Also, I mean, one thing I did pick up as a lawyer is you just kind of like learn how to grind. And it's definitely in the startup world important. So you get that sort of, you've got horsepower and you know how to use it. And I don't know, I think that's helpful. And you can convey that to people. I mean, honestly, I think it helps. Like if you're trying to get into a small company, like I'm willing to work really hard is an okay thing to say. And people generally like hearing that, especially if they're trying to build something, because they're looking for people, I think, with that sort of mentality. So that's another piece of advice. And then just, like you're probably really good at learning, if you went to Stanford Law School. And so, again, like if you come in and you don't know you've never heard of, let's say the ticketing system that you're using, or you don't know how to access the database or whatever, you'll figure it out. And yeah, you might have like an awkward conversation and feel like a little bit, oh, I wish I had known that before asking, but the next time you'll know. So, I mean, there is an element of just sort of like, you have to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable, but if you are willing to do that, which you probably are, if you're willing to abandon, a legal career that you spent 3 years and going to the bar and all that stuff, you're probably willing to do, a lot, then you'll be fine, I think, honestly. And it's just about putting yourself out there and being willing to, to take the jump and finding that, place to land.
It is like riffing off of what Patrick and Mark said a little bit. I agree. Like, I don't think there's anything special that a product manager does that someone who's gone to Stanford Law School wouldn't be able to do fairly easily. There's just like a barrier of perception where people might think that it's a technical role, even though it really isn't. And to Mark's point, it's just one of the ways to breaking that barrier is just like quickly learning the jargon that a product manager uses. And there are a variety of ways to do that, like talk to other product managers or like go on Medium. There are a million articles about, what exactly this role entails and what people do. And then if you adopt that language, it makes it a lot easier to show that you know what you're talking about.
In fact, you mentioned one thing that I thought was interesting, which is, getting in on kind of a company at the early stage and showing them that, like, you're willing to do what it takes. And just made me think of, when I was at the startup I was working at, how much of a pain recruiting is. And it's really hard to find good people. Like, it's extremely difficult. Every startup is spending way too much time and energy to fail 95% of the time with finding really good people. And, and sometimes that's because you really need this unicorn that's going to come in and do this particular role. And in those cases, you're not going to be able to jump in and do that as a person just coming in, without the expertise. But in a lot of cases, they just need smart people to jump in and, help steer the ship. And in those cases, you coming onto their doorstep and making it clear that you're willing to do what it takes is going to go a really long way. It's honestly kind of a gift to a lot of these companies, I think.
Awesome. This is more of a niche question, but we got a fair number of questions ahead of the event covering off on this. So people were curious if your bar status, if you did a clerkship, if you did lit versus transactional, do any of those have any meaningful bearing on what sort of operational or non-legal roles you can do at a company at any scale?
What's that stuff?
Exactly. Well, that was the answer of most people at a startup. Okay.
That's the law, right? Yeah, they don't know.
Yeah, I didn't clerk. I'm a member of the New York bar. I'd hold on to that for sure. It seems like a good thing to keep. No, people don't really know, I think, what that clerking for sure. I mean, I think generally won't register with somebody outside of the legal world too much. I mean, well, they'll, they might know about it and they'll probably be like, wow, that's impressive. But, anyway, so, and I did transactional. That is going to be more useful, I think, in like like if you can, I definitely think it's super valuable having done transactional work. I don't have to ask a lot of questions that other people might have to ask, or I can just read something quickly and say, this looks fine, or do an NDA or whatever myself without having to, oh, they marked up this provision about like notice or how long we retain the records. I don't care, like that kind of thing. It's nice to be able to do that. So it's helpful. I find it actually very helpful to have had the transactional background and kind of have a sense basically about what's okay and not okay in a contract to accept. So anyway, that was I didn't do any lit at all. So.
Right.
Your CLE history is critical though. Right.
Yeah. Long story short, most people are going to bucket you as a lawyer and they're not going to dig any deeper into what that actually means. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip down a little bit to try to make this a little bit more tactical. So say you have identified a company you want to work at and you're now in the interview process. I'd love it if the panel can comment on how might you approach interviewing for a non-legal job differently than you would as when you were interviewing for a law firm or through OCR or that traditional process, because it might be foreign to people who've never interviewed for a job outside of that context.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I mean, OCI type interviews, you're just kind of showing up and people are lobbing questions they haven't really put much time and thought or energy into, and they're just kind of seeing if you're sentient and not a serial killer. And it's a very different game, I think, for, startup interviews. Like, they're trying to gauge your skill set. They're trying to, a lot of times, really gauge your interest and passion about the company and the industry. So I think it's really important to be fluent in what's actually happening in the industry. It's important to be fluent, as Mansi said, like, go read a bunch of Medium articles, listen to podcasts, just really like get yourself very steeped in the ecosystem, so you can talk intelligently about what's going on. Because, they're not going to ask you about, your experience with, workflow, software, because you probably don't have any, but they will kind of try to get an understanding of how interested you are and how much you know about the field, about the industry, and about the company.
I have a few things to add on to that. One is I would definitely focus on and make sure you have a really strong narrative around, what you've done so far and why you're a good fit for this, and specifically be prepared to, answer the question of like, why did you go to law school so that you could now do X? And, I don't think anyone really reads like resumes or cover letters, but people definitely will check out your LinkedIn beforehand and make a really quick impression of what your narrative is. So make sure your LinkedIn is kind of telling that story, even that little tagline under your name, kind of updating it for people to really understand what you're doing. So like Stanford grad seeking operational roles at startups or whatever it is, so that they can quickly understand what you're trying to do when they see that JD on your LinkedIn. Second, I agree with like just reading, getting to know everything you can about that company and that industry. So looking on the internet, coming up with like good questions to ask during the interview process to show that you've thought about the industry, you've thought about their particular business, and reaching out to other people through your network who might actually work at that company and setting up time with them outside of or prior to the interview process to gather as much information about the company before you start formal conversations with them. You'll have probably be interviewing with people across different functions, which is a difference from when you're going through like a law firm interview process. So learn a little bit more about, the types of functions you would be working with and come up with good sort of insightful questions and talking points when you meet with them. And then lastly, like in non-legal roles, you're much more likely to see some sort of like take-home project or case study or like panel style interview where you're asked to demonstrate your thought process or apply your thought process to like a real world problem that this business might encounter. And so spending some time practicing that or learning more about that process might be a good idea too.
I think that everyone's kind of said, I agree with everything. Last little point I would add, especially if you're looking potentially at startups, is it tends to be, it's much less well organized than like the law firm recruiting process. And so just, persistence and staying top of mind, like you have to do the work in some cases, because it's, it's just a different environment you're trying to enter. So don't, be persistent, make it happen. Don't worry if it seems a little bit, all over the place. It might just be because it's a smaller company and that's how things are at smaller companies. So yeah, and you'll probably have to do a take home. Don't like get offended about it. It is very normal. You're going to almost 100% have to do that. So.
Awesome. So to wrap up, before we open it up to the couple of questions that we've got, knowing what you know now, having made the transition outside of practice into sort of an operating or product role, is there anything you know now that you wish you knew back then before you made the transition, or anything that think would be useful for the folks out there to know ahead of time in terms of mulling when, if ever, to make the jump?
That you learned a lot of valuable things, I think, in law school, and being a lawyer is definitely in the world of non-lawyers. Like I feel almost bad for them sometimes. I'm like, how do you what? Like, what kind of question is that? Obviously, this is fine to sign, or no, you can't sign that. And I don't know, that you have like a really valuable skill that you should just like, you might not want to do it forever, and that's cool, but I think it's okay to feel like good about it and be really proud about it and talk about it in a positive way. And definitely people want to hear positive things if they're interviewing for you for a job. They don't want to hear that you're like they're the lifeboat, that it's going to be an immediate. Don't do that, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. I would say, this kind of comes full circle to something we were touching upon earlier, but make sure that you're actually going towards something and not just away from the legal job, right? Have an idea about what you're actually going for and why this thing is what you're going for and why it's a good fit for you. People can, be very passionate, talk up all of these jobs that sound great. And maybe they are for that, but maybe they are just great for them. Maybe they're not actually a good fit for you. So I think you really need to, reflect upon the reasons and the justification for doing what you're doing and make sure that it's a, well thought out approach.
I'll just add a couple of things. I would say like that if you're transitioning away from the law, that first job is going to be the hardest one to get. But if you're willing to like overcome that initial pay cut or ego blow, like as others have mentioned, you're obviously, really smart and qualified to do a variety of things, and you're going to prove yourself pretty quickly, and it's going to open up a lot of opportunities. So it gets easier and easier over time. I would say like a combination of, applying cold and working through people I knew worked for me. Like sometimes like those cold applications are a nice way to just sort of like warm up to the interview process and what to expect. And then, a lot of the great opportunities came through personal connections. And then lastly, I think just knowing that and thinking, taking a step back and reminding myself that perspective that careers aren't linear, and it's pretty normal to learn about yourself and what's out there and like iterate along the way. And sometimes you take what's perceived as a step backwards, take a step forward. One of the books that I stumbled upon sort of later in my transition that I found really helpful was called Designing Your Life, which I'm sure people may or may not be familiar with, but I think it's an awesome book that sort of gave me the confidence to pursue the career that was right for me and gave really practical advice for how to think about what my ideal job was and how to work towards it through stepwise change.
I totally second that. It was or still is a DSchool course, right?
Yeah, it's a BSchool course, and if you can get into the course, that's awesome too. I think it's pretty competitive from what I can tell, but the book is really good as well.
Awesome. So guys, since we're at time, I would suggest we go to one of the questions that was submitted during the session. I think just because it's something worth commenting on. So this question is addressed specifically to Mark. So was it difficult for you to transition back to a traditional legal role, after being in an operations startup role? And what do prospective legal employers think about your time outside the law? So does the door go both ways, and does it close that the metaphor is falling apart? You know what I'm saying? Yeah,
I mean, I don't think it was a hindrance at all. I think if anything, it was a help. Right. I mean, it's a different perspective. It's a different way that the law firm can kind of sell its practice and the scope of its expertise, and so being able to say like, oh, here's Mark, he ran, legal and business operations at the startup. He's done it soup to nuts. Like that's a nice little nugget to throw in there from a business development perspective. And, it's, how to do this work. Right. So if you know how to do the work, you're going to be able to jump right back in.
Awesome. So I'll follow up with the other people who submitted questions that we couldn't get to. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to share their experience, the SLS External Affairs Office and the Career Center. And one thing to flag for students is they actually hold a workshop for students interested in non-legal jobs roughly every year, and they keep a recording of it. So students should have access to that. So if this is something you want to think about before you graduate, that's another resource that's available for you. So thanks everyone again for their time. Hopefully this was useful to you. Feel free to reach out to any of us if we can ever be helpful to you as you think through potentially ever making a transition outside of practice. Either way, all the best, stay safe, and good luck.
Thanks.